Hey everybody, Joseph Rothschild here, aka... And it is time for another X thread. That just doesn't feel right to say. Last week we looked at decks from the OCG that never made it to the TCG, and now we are going to do the opposite and examine some decks that were innovated in the TCG despite never gaining attention overseas. Now before we start, I really do want to drive home saying overseas and stateside to refer to the TCG and OCG does not mean I think the only TCG area is America and the only OCG area is Japan. I got a lot of shit on the last one from Europeans who wanted me to pretend that their backwater Eastern Europe post-Soviet country deserved as much respect for innovating a deck like Auroradon Turbo as America did. Well, I'll give it to you, if only so you'll stop commenting under my video. But like a great bandit once said, every nation in the world belongs to America. So mine is Casino Tier. Casino Tier is a variant of Tier that was popular before the release of Magnificent Mavens and the Ishizu monsters. In the OCG, prior to this period, Sprite was far and away the best deck. Tearlament occupied something like 6% of the metagame at that period. But in the TCG, it's arguable that at events like the YCS in Canada, this was the better deck, that Sprite took second fiddle to this very consistent despite seeming very random strategy. There's a couple of things that maybe explain why this wasn't popular in the OCG. Garua didn't exist, and it's a fantastic, not only super poly target against Sprite, it's also a mechanism by which you can get a 6 onto your side of the field in Tearlament, but that doesn't account for like a 40% metagame percentage difference. Anyway, let's see what else happened. Right on time, here's a European Pro, folks. I think I speak for everyone when I say USA. USA! USA!
Have we forgotten?
For whatever reason, the OCG has been resistant to using Runic as the versatile generic engine we use it as over here, and I think the Fur Hire variant is a great example of this. Yes, in the OCG, Mist Rune, as it was known, was used almost exclusively as a mill condition. Here, we use it as 20 instant fusions, and it's enabled a bunch of really fun decks, including decks like this one, Runic Fur Hire, which, to my understanding, functionally don't exist in the OCG. Spence says, in the TCG, we were Buster Locking with Union Carrier in decks like Dragon Link in 2020. OCG didn't figure out the Buster Lock until 2 full years later, when they started doing it in Splight. This is an interesting one. Dragon Buster Destruction Sword isn't an obvious pick for a Floodgate, and it did take some time for people to figure out that like Union Carrier into Destruction Sword was a good way to beat cards like a Dark Ruler no more. But the release of cards like that was prolonged in the OCG, which is probably why they weren't examining it. Though some individuals in the comments have actually offered a couple of alternative explanations. When it first released, it was the same set as Gumblar, and the mindset was, why would you lock them from the extra when you could just hand loot them for 3 to 5? Maybe this is a good time to talk about Europe, because yes, Hope is right. Rika has seen next to no experimentation in the OCG, but it's pretty much seen no experimentation in America either. It's only Europe. It's only Europe where they know how to play this deck. Neshi says, Conclave control. Neshi, it's not that the OCG didn't catch on to this. It's that you are the only one who ever played it. This deck was exclusively a Western flash in the pan, one of my favorite decks ever, playing a bunch of bulk like Power Giants and Refusion. Never seen again after 2016 and never at all in the OCG. So during one of the many 2016 formats, this was an exceptionally popular pick online. It only ever got a couple of tops at the premier level, but it's really strong. The concept is your opponent max sees you and you deck them out. This deck was, unironically, just like a 2025 combo strategy. Like, it's a type of combo deck that we will not have for another couple of years. He's been doing this combo for 10 minutes. That opener looped 4 cards. This one seems like one of the biggest success stories going from the OCG to the TCG. Emancipator. This was a deck that was left to rot by the OCG and became the best deck of the summer of 2020 over the TCG, becoming the boogeyman of the quarantine era. There are a number of reasons why this happened. Would you believe that one of the reasons why this deck was so popular in the TCG and not in the OCG is because of the lopsided COVID response by those two nations? For the first couple of months of quarantine in the United States, Yu-Gi-Oh! Players basically just did solo combo theory under the assumption that there would not be another event nor a list. And so a lot of old retro formats and the current format got labbed out to a degree that they have not been since. The amount of interest in breaking Yu-Gi-Oh! Formats was just there in a way it hasn't been ever. Like, the Everybody sitting at home period of COVID in the United States is responsible for some of the biggest innovations in GOAT thought, Edison thought, and TCG thought. And one of those innovations was this, a deck that people thought they would be able to hit the ground running with once COVID was over. However, this deck's entire lifespan took place during quarantine. Team NA fielded 4 Infernity decks in Worlds 2014, and 3 of the 4 made top 8, including both first and third. This is NA's only Worlds victory to this day. Infernity was getting to be considered the best deck by the end of Hat format in NA, but barely any other region even considered it. This is strange because it's a Worlds format, which means that, like, we were all labbing the format at the same time and could have easily come to different conclusions because there's just not a lot of time to practice. But this deck was so good. Oh my god, look at this. Triple Soul Charge legal in this format, and you didn't want to play a combo deck? Come on! When the OCG got Gishki cards, a hand loop featuring Gust Kraken quickly took over. However, when the cards came to the TCG, Gust was preemptively hit, which led to TCG players innovating the Mind Augus FTK.
And this is really interesting loops again, which is going to be part 3 of the video.
That's right. There is an additional video to explain how the loops work. So let's do the library one.
Okay, so this is the really bad kill I talked about earlier.
So he goes on to explain how you can do loops that are resistant to Effect Veiler, how you can do loops that beat pretty much any hand trap. But the short of it is, you get to a position where you've drawn your entire deck really quickly and very easily. This was like an 80 or 90% FTK. And then the way you win the game, and I'm not fucking with you, is by looping Dark World Dealings, which allows you and your opponent to draw a card and discard a card. You will deck them one card at a time. If you've never experienced the Mind Augus FTK, it's one of the most frustrating FTKs in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! The History of Yu-Gi-Oh! Episode that features it is maybe one of our worst, just because it is a literal 40-minute combo. All right, we gotta stand up for our friends over in Latin America. The USA and Europe have given Yu-Gi-Oh! A lot, but they could never have dreamed of the Koalo top. Dustin says, oh my god, we have an OCG player rather than a bunch of Americans just sort of speculating about what the OCG looks like. During Tier 0, the only way to play Runic was to blanket prevent monster effects, since the Ishizus basically countered Fountain, plus stopped tiers from activating. So seeing Naturia being started to brew overseas, especially after Dabble, I was admittedly very skeptical. While the OCG is pretty famous for not touching Runic, even to this day, they don't really consider it to the degree that we do when deck building in the United States and associated TCG territories. This one makes sense, right? If your only familiarity with a series of cards happens during a period when Mudora and Keldo actively counter the strategy, so you have to be playing like negate all monster effects type floodgates in order to even have any sort of success with the strategy, I could see being averse to testing with it after those cards are removed from the format. Ooh, let's see Joshua Schmidt react to this part of the video. Yes. Early on, the OCG really focused on how That Grass Looks Greener interacted with the Infernoids, but never really conceptualized the card as a mechanism to get some advantage in a deck that was already independently popular and just had 60 playables. Joshua Schmidt's 60-card Paleozoic Frog list is, to this day, one of my favorite decks I've ever had the pleasure of playing on History of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's called the Sacred 60 for a reason. This thing is tight. Well, I think over the past 2 weeks, we've realized that both TCG players and OCG players are completely capable of missing extremely powerful decks. Which is why, of course, we should, as I've said a million times before, have a unified ban list once again. See you next week. Gold Pride Punk. It's surprising that such a good rogue deck here sees no attention in the OCG, especially during formats where Rescue Ace and Pearly were relevant. I couldn't really tell you. Oh, right.